Absolute liars is the headline over on Politico. This is an absolutely breathtaking story. You will recall back months and months ago when I laid out how, well, when it became public, the memo that Christopher Miller wrote as the acting Secretary of Defense, in which he was saying to the D.C. National Guard, you may not assist the Capitol Police unless you hear specifically and directly from me. And then that permission was withheld until, for several hours, until it was clear that Mike Pence had not been hung and that the ballots were secure. And at that point, these people inside the Trump administration said, okay, cool, go ahead. And one of them was Mike Flynn's brother. And now a former D.C. National Guard official is blowing the whistle on this thing. And why there is not a congressional, well, maybe there is, and it's just something we don't know about. But this is Colonel Earl Matthews, who was on the National Security Council. He worked at the Pentagon during the Trump administration. And he's calling out two Army generals, specifically Charles Flynn, Mike Flynn's brother, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations on January 6th, and Lieutenant General Walter Piatt, Piatt? I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Piatt, the Director of the Army Staff. And these guys were on this phone call where they said, no, you can't send the National Guard into D.C. And according to General Matthews, Colonel Matthews, according to Colonel Matthews, these guys, he was on the phone call with these guys, and he says they said, "Oh, you can't send the National Guard in because having soldiers come into the Capitol would look like we were a tin horn dictatorship. You can't have that happen. So just let the mob ransack the Capitol." This is what Mike Flynn's brother was saying. But then when he went before Congress, or at least Piatt went before Congress and testified, he said, "Oh, no, that's not what we were saying. We there was just miscommunication and bumbling around, and it was they really had no answer." But he calls them absolute and unmitigated liars. His phrase, not mine. Colonel Matthews said this is the memo that he wrote about these two generals, who are, by the way, still two generals. In fact, General Flynn is now in charge of the Pacific Army Fleet. I mean, he got a promotion out of this. He said, and I quote, "Every leader in the D.C. Guard wanted to respond and knew they could respond to the riot at the seat of government." He said, instead, they sat stunned watching in the armory during the attack. They were just blocks away, or just miles away, and they had to sit in the armory and watch this attack on television because Chris Miller, the Secretary of Defense, and Mike Flynn's brother, who was in charge of the Army, said, "No, you can't do it." The piece is in Politico. It's titled "Absolute Liars," Politico.com. They note Matthews' memo levels several major accusations that Flynn and Piatt lied to Congress about their response, that the Army has created its own closely held revisionist document about the Capitol riot that's, quote, this is from his memo, that is worthy of the best Stalinist or North Korean propagandist. It's amazing. Politico reached out to both Flynn and Piatt, and neither one of them responded. The head of the Capitol Police at the time, Stephen Sund, pleaded on this phone call for the National Guard to come to the Capitol. Matthews recalled. He was on the call again. Colonel Matthews was on the call. And the head of the Capitol Police was begging Mike Flynn's brother to send the National Guard, and was begging Piatt, the director of the Army Staff, one of the top generals in the Pentagon. And Flynn was the Army's director of operations. These two men were the highest-ranking Army officials on this call at 2:30 in the afternoon of January 6th. Matthews wrote, Lieutenant General Piatt stated that it would not be his best military advice to recommend to the Secretary of the Army and the D.C. National Guard be allowed to deploy to the Capitol at this time. Both Flynn and Piatt stated that the optics of having uniformed military personnel deployed to the U.S. Capitol would not be good. They both told Congress that that was not the case. And according to this colonel, they lied. Piott and Flynn at 2:37 p.m. recommended for the D.C. Guard to stand by rather than deploying. 4 minutes later, according to that Guard timeline, Flynn, again, I'm quoting from the Politico piece, quote, advised D.C. National Guard to stand by until the request had been routed to then Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy and then Acting Defense Secretary Chris Miller, the guy who wrote the memo saying you may not help the Capitol Police. You'll recall that. I've read it on the air at least a dozen times. Matthews writes, everyone on the call, except for Piott and Flynn, who were saying, no, we won't send soldiers, everyone on the call was, quote, astounded. Now, Flynn said, quote, I never expressed a concern about the visuals, image, or public perception of sending guardsmen to the Capitol. This is what he told a member of Congress when he was asked. Matthews in this memo says that is outright perjury in front of Congress. He was under oath. Matthews says that assertion constitutes, quote, the willful deception of Congress. I mean, it doesn't get worse than this. This is mind-boggling. The Pentagon lied and people died. You can read about it over at Politico.com. It's just incredible.